Welcome to this month's tutorial. So this month we are going to be looking at some really loose poppies. I've created a whole bunch of different paintings here, just kind of experimenting with the shape and movement of poppies. And I'm going to talk you through how we can take something that we see around us, that we photographed or that's live in front of us, and walk you through really painting a lot of movement and really using this freedom in the paint and movement for creating some really beautiful paintings. So one of the first things that I do when I'm sitting down to paint anything is take a look at the subject that I'm painting from all kinds of different angles, see it, up close, farther away, and really start to see all the details of it and see and recognize the movement of it as well. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start sketching what I'm seeing just with a pencil, just on a scrap piece of paper, and just sort of start to see what shapes are going to make up my flower and how do I get this bud to look like it's just really floating gracefully out in the world with all these little curly-Q stems that it has. What does the shape look like as the stem meets the flower? And how can I create that movement and that look on the page? And the important part of being able to sketch in the beginning is not what it looks like in your sketch. It doesn't really matter, especially in your initial ones. What does it actually look like on the page? But what's important is that you are starting to get that feel and that muscle memory in your hand. What if I want to do one that's facing right at me? It looks very different from the ones coming up from the side or going out. So if that's something that I want to add, just being able to recognize how that goes. And this muscle memory is going to be really important. Even though we're using a pencil now and we will come in with paint later, it's the same general motion in our hand, and we're really training our body how to create that really loose movement on the page. And especially if you're trying to create something that has movement in the page, like a bird or a plant like this, you want to really understand what that movement looks like and start to create that. So once I've sketched it in pencil a little bit, I'm gonna come in with a paintbrush. I'm just using a round brush here. I'm gonna start getting my paints wet. I'm gonna use a crimson red for the petals. And then with the brush, I want to still on a scrap piece of paper, keep practicing the shapes and the movement that I'm going to need for creating this painting. So I'm gonna come in and experiment with different ways of creating the shapes of the petals. Do I want to primarily use the body of my brush and come in and really kind of create that general shape like that? Do I want to come in and start with the body of my brush, but then come in with only water on my brush and no pigment and kind of pull that out so that it gets the same shape, but it's not quite as dense and maybe a little bit more ethereal. Maybe that's one that's more in the background, still with a touch of pigment, but not as bright. Or do I want to come in and do maybe outlines, maybe not use the body of the brush, but instead use just the very tip and a really light touch on the page. And I like to do this before I start painting, partially as a warm-up, just to kind of get my body and mind in the zone of recognizing that I'll be painting here, but also as a way to see what I like without having any kind of pressure on myself. So you can see there's a variety of different ways we can also create that bud. And so, practice this for a little while, experiment, really get that feel in your hands. And then when you're ready, we can set these aside. I usually just put them right up above where I was. If there are any that I particularly like, I especially want to be able to see them. close to where I'm painting. So now we're going to come in and we're going to start painting. And there's a couple ways we can do this. We can just come in directly with paint and just start feeling it out. I think for the purpose of this tutorial, I want to come in with my pencil first. I'm just going to lightly sketch out what I want to paint. In this instance, I like kind of the layout of this and how it's coming from behind the page where you maybe can't see all of it. And then I am going to just give myself some very kind of loose guidelines on the open flowers here. And I might take some liberties and, you know, move some of them up a little bit so that I am not necessarily copying this exactly, but just to give myself a little bit of a chance to experiment with my own layout on the page. And it's really helpful too to have already kind of sketched these out beforehand, because then I also have the benefit of knowing roughly what it feels like and how to create the movement that I'm wanting to create without having to actually necessarily even have without having to necessarily even copy the exact layout that I have here, because I can create however I want to create it, just based purely on movement. All right. Okay, so I've sketched it out a little bit, very lightly, very loosely. I don't want to necessarily be beholden to my pencil sketch, nor do I want that to be the primary thing that I'm seeing when my painting is done. But I do want to come in and paint on top of this without erasing too much, because I personally have really been enjoying that combination. If you don't want your pencil lines to show through, just go over it and very lightly erase over the lines so that you can still see them on the page for yourself, but you won't necessarily be able to see them under the paint once it's applied. And then we're going to start with the flowers. So just coming in with that pigment, and I'm going to clean my brush off and pull that pigment over here a little bit. Going to sort of combine all of the elements that we practiced in our initial practice page with just some outlines and some where I pulled the paint a little bit out from where I applied all the pigment, and just kind of see what I can create that way. I'm hoping that it will be able to give me a little bit of detailing without losing that really loose watercolor feel. And I'm starting with the open flowers because when I add the stems here in a minute, I want to be able to pull down some of that color to get that sort of watercolor combined mixing feel on the page. All right. And this one is sort of intended to be one of those ones that are maybe kind of half open and they're not quite open all the way yet. So we'll see how that ends up looking here. All right, so I'm gonna come in with some green now. You can certainly try to do a very similar green as real life. I'm gonna mix together Payne's Gray with a little bit of a lemony mossy green that I have, just because I happen to like that kind of combination of green. And then coming in while my blooms are still wet, I'm gonna come in with a wet but not overly saturated brush with some green pigment on this. And I'm gonna barely touch at the base where they meet here. And I'm gonna barely touch because I want a little bit of that combination of the paint together, but I don't want it to be really overwhelming or get muddy. But where I can see the stem coming out of the base, I do want it to touch because, you know, in real life, you get a little bit of that reflection of green onto the petal. And so I want to kind of give the illusion of that without actually coming in and physically painting green into it. And now for this one, I'm gonna have some greens coming off the side a little bit more. As these flowers are opening from that bud state, the buds that have been wrapped around it open up and the flower starts to bloom out of there. So just kind of giving that illusion of that little green cocoon starting to fall off of there. And while for the petals, I was mostly using the body of the round brush here, for the stem, I'm mostly using the very tip of the round brush so I can get a thinner line and just have more precise control over where I'm applying these pigment marks on the page. And it's kind of, you know, I think it's interesting to experiment with creating really loose watercolor when you're coming in with this technique of the wet on dry technique, because so much loose watercolor generally comes from more of a wet on wet technique. And so to be able to come in and understand how you can still get that really loose feel while using a wet on dry technique can be kind of fun to experiment with and to practice your skills. Now, if you are feeling like you want a little more understanding of control of the brush or how to create different leaves or anything like that, I do have tutorials up both on YouTube and on Skillshare. Skillshare, I have an Exploring Watercolor class where we really go into detail of how to actually use watercolor. So if that's something that you feel like you're needing and you want practice with all these different techniques, wet on wet, wet on dry, combining them on the page and what that really looks like and practicing that, definitely check out those classes. And also on YouTube, I have tutorials like how to paint green leaves and stuff, which is just based on primarily building up off of one specific shape that you can create. And those classes go into a lot of detail, so I don't want to spend a lot of time in this tutorial teaching you the same thing that you can find there. But of course, if you have any questions, just let me know. Now I'm going to do a couple stems here that branch off the page, right? Because this is a bouquet that's coming from over there. So I don't want to have all my flowers over here without the illusion of it also going off the page. And this little red dot here, I am going to have be a little bit more of an open bud that is really just about to fully open and bloom and drop its little cocoon here. All right, so now at this point, I might come in with some more red and just add some dimension by layering on top of where it's already dried so that I can kind of control where I want shadow or where I might want some darkness or light. Keeping in mind, of course, that the more layers I add, the darker the paint will become. So adding more layers is essentially creating shadow or creating something that is going to pop out a little bit more in the foreground. The lighter colors will sort of immerse themselves in the background, and the darker areas are gonna come forward a little bit while still maintaining that look of having highlights and shadows on the page. Now I'll just do the same thing with my green and with my buds and stems here, just coming in and where I want to add more shadow or maybe a little more definition, I'm going to come in with a second layer. I don't necessarily want to go over the entire green area that I've already applied, but if I feel like it would benefit in an area for adding a little bit more shadow or a little more definition, that is where I'm going to come in. And since I laid down my pencil down in the beginning and you can still really see it, I'm also really going to take advantage of that. And once we're done applying the paint, I will probably come in and help define different areas by adding more pigment or by adding more graphite in, and also probably by drawing in just a few little buds and I think petals just with graphite like I did in here, because that is, for me, that's my style and that's what I really like to do. But of course, you all have your own style, and so you can use your own style to create your own bouquets, and just use this as practice for a looser watercolor feel. Now I'm just coming in with some water and I'm just pulling down on some of these colors to add almost like a melting effect on some of these areas. I like the look of it, and it feels to me like it really gives it a bit of a more loose watercolor feel. And then it's a very light grayish blue here. I'm going to come in and just barely add some definition down here in the vase. And where the water is, I'm going to come in with water on a clean brush and just go over the stems so they get that kind of ethereal, watery look while maintaining that loose vibe that we have going on here. And now I'll come in with some water and pigment, and I'm just gonna do a couple little splatters on the page. I just like to hold my paintbrush about an inch or two above the page and just tap on it. The more water you have on your brush and the bigger your brush is, the bigger your splatters are going to be. So if you find that your splatters are too small or too big, try changing how much water and pigment you have on your brush, and try changing the size of the brush that you're using as well. All right, so I quite like this. And it's not dry yet, but I am going to start coming in where it is a little bit drier in the background areas, and just start kind of adding very light details by adding additional buds, maybe darkening up lines that I already have on there. Sometimes I like to come in too and just add even a whole additional line outside of what's already painted or whole additional petal, just in graphite that doesn't have any paint in it. All right, and that is a very loose, very lovely little poppy. Hey guys, it's me again, Isa. If you liked this tutorial, make sure you subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Tell me something you loved about the class. Feel free to ask me some questions, but definitely subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future tutorials. See you next time.